So projectors in GeoPix 1.0 are kind of an important part of the process. They're how you get content onto your LEDs or your pixels or your DMX lights, whatever they might be. Uh, in the end of the day, it's the conduit through which two-dimensional content gets projected onto a three-dimensional world. And there's lots of different ways you can do that. When you have the third dimension at your disposal and you can fully transform things, rotate, scale, it really opens up the doors to lots of crazy, weird patterns that you never thought you'd see from some really simple content. And so what we're going to do in this tutorial is really focus on exploring the topic of projectors and not so much accomplishing a particular task. And this will lead into the next few videos of this series nicely, because we will get back to projectors and actually do some more concrete things with them, but knowing some of the interesting ways you can use them will give you some insight on how you can tweak your own projects in the future and come up with some really cool alternatives. So without anything else, let's just jump into it. I've got my LEDs off here. I'm going to turn them back on, set live data, and this is about where we left off the last tutorial. If you remember, we had at the beginning of the last tutorial just one panel lighting up, and we mapped out the rest of these 10 by 10s fairly quickly in I think about 15 or 20 minutes, and that was fairly successful. So the next thing that we want to do, we have content playing here, but we don't really know where this is coming from. Next thing we want to do is start adding our own projectors and our own content. So the first thing I want to tell you about is this sample texture you see right now. This is what you see by default when you start a project, so that you can see some content immediately without getting too deep into the software. But you can leave this on. As soon as you start making projectors, this goes away. However, if you want the more exact version of what you should be seeing, you can actually just turn off this default projector in the settings. So if you head over to the settings and you go down in this list here, you will see an entry that says default projector, and you can just turn that off. And as you can see, everything went dark. That's fine. You won't be able to see me, but that's not too important. I'm actually going to switch to a different mode here, and we're going to go ahead and drop a projector in the scene. If you want to find projectors, they're on the left bar. If you go to the Create tab at the bottom left, you'll see them up here under Technology. So just click on Projector, and depending on where your main pixel array is, you may or may not see some color right away. This needs to be moved back. Right now it's kind of overlapping on the LEDs, so it's kind of glitching out, so just need to move it back. And once you do that, you'll see the full projection happening across at least the area that falls within its range. So there's a few ways we can go about getting this projector to cover the full spectrum. We can do it manually by just adjusting the TX, TY values and scale, of course. Once you reach the end of this, you can just double click and type in a number. You can type in 4. You can also use your mouse wheel and you can scroll inside the fields. If you hold Control, you'll scroll. That's not Control. You'll scroll in smaller increments with Control, and Shift will do the opposite. It'll give you bigger increments. So that's a useful way to kind of finely tweak and adjust values. And so that's one way. You can just go ahead and dial it in manually, and you'll often find yourself doing that when you want to achieve a very specific look. But if you just want to start off with something that's very form-fitting, I actually recommend in the projector attributes, if you scroll down a bit, it's about halfway down, you'll see these 4 buttons that say Fit Aspect X and Y, and Fit Scene, and Fit Selection. These do pretty much what you expect them to do. Fit Scene, we'll start with that. They basically fit your projector to any and all pixels that are in your scene. So I click that, and it skews the projector, and it stretches it, and it replaces it so that it's covering the bounds of our entire area. Now, this is very useful in certain cases when you're not using regular content. For example, if you're running some kind of basic ramp to control a DMX attribute going from left to right, top to bottom, this might be ideal, because then you have no extra fluff on the sides, and as soon as your ramp passes the right side, it's re-entering the left side, and so it gives you kind of like a perfectly looping system, right, depending on what kind of content you're using and what it's for. However, for basic RGB textures, this may not be as aesthetically pleasing. You may actually want this to be constrained to the aspect ratio of your content. So for example, if we're using 1920 by 1080 or something less. I recommend less. You don't really need that much for LEDs. Then you might want to keep this thing constrained to the aspect of the content. So that's a good reason to learn how to use the fit aspect X and Y. Essentially, these just scale Y when you click on this and X when you click on this to whatever it takes to make the aspect square. So in this case, I click Y, it scales Y to make the aspect square. And then if we had, let's say we had something like this again, and we clicked X, it's going to scale X to make the aspect square. So depending on which way you need to go, if you have a wide texture or a tall texture, you might want to click one of these two, but there are two different options, and they basically accomplish the same thing for different directions. So fit scene, aspect Y, that tends to be my workflow for just getting the projector to a good ground zero to kind of start working from there. Fit selection we're going to talk about a little bit later. It's a very useful button that requires you to have some fixtures selected first. Before we continue, I'm going to go ahead and expand my tree here. So I'm going to hold shift on my keyboard and click on the plus, and that's just going to expand everything fully. And this works in reverse too. You can shift click to suck everything back into its parent, and then you can click once without shift to expand just one level. So you can quickly expand hierarchies and collapse them very easily. Cool, so we have one projector in our scene, and I'm going to go and call this projector RGB. Actually keep it short, PRGB. And this by default is going to have the default ramp plugged into its texture socket. So in order to change this, we can either type a name of a new node in here, or we can choose one from our IO textures, which is right here. This is basically an easy way of filling out this field. You can type a value in, or when you click on it, it just fills that value out for you. So for example, if I clear this and click the default ramp, it just fills that in for us. But where do these names come from? Texture, default ramp, these are things that live in the IO tab. We've probably talked about this some before in other videos, depending on where you're starting, but the IO tab is the kind of like the back end, I guess you could say. It's kind of the behind the scenes content and routing system area where you can pretty much route stuff from one area to another. You can connect things and drive things with other things. For example, if you have a MIDI controller, which we're going to talk about this later, you would actually connect your MIDI controller to various things through this tab of the software. It's also where you load in most of the time, 99% of the time, this is where you load in your content. So if you have a folder of video clips and you want to start loading some of those clips into the system to have access to them, this is how you would do that. So we're actually going to do that. We'll talk more about this tab in greater depth in another tutorial series, but for now we're going to just kind of stick with the basics. So over here on the left, if you just scroll down to where it says video clips, choose the folder that's on your computer, and it should just have some MP4s or some HapQs, some kind of video file. HapQ is a very good format to use. It's recommended. But if you don't know about HapQ, don't worry about it. Just use MP4 for now. HapQs are GPU friendly, and they the way they work is a lot of the decoding, or it goes straight to the GPU, so no decoding happens on the CPU, which means you can go forwards and backwards and scrub without any kind of lag, which is great for playing clips in reverse and forwards and 2 times and all that stuff. So anyways, look into that if you are looking for more versatile video clip format to use in GeoPix. So I've already got a folder here, so I can click Show Bin, but you can also click on the video clips tag here. It does the same thing, it opens the bin. And so this is a folder of clips I've got on my hard drive, some loops I've purchased and some free ones I've downloaded, and so we can pretty much just start clicking and add any of these to our graph. So I'm going to add this one. This one's nice. I'm going to move this over a little bit. And by the way, to move things in the IO graph under Tools up here, you can just go to Move Mode, and then you just click and you move it and click to place. It's just like the editor, except you have 2 dimensions instead of 3. Alright, let's just drop a few other interesting clips down. This one's fun. This one could be interesting. I like this one. And let's see something that's a little bit more video oriented. Okay, so we've got a few clips here. And if you zoom in, you'll notice that these clips have the name of their node is actually the name of the file, which is fine, and that's the way it's going to come in, but these are pretty long names and they tend to be a little bit harder to read because they go off the edge. So I'm actually going to rename these as something else. Red lines, nothing too creative. Spinning bricks. X marks the spot. Spiral. Walkman. Okay, so we've got a few clips, they're named. A few other things to note here. This orange bar is your progress meter. We're not going to talk any more about it now, but that is not just information. You can actually use that to drive other things. It's like a percentage, a 0 to 1 value. And all your clips have that. You also have the resolution they come in at and a few other interesting attributes listed there. But for now, all you have to do is place your clips here, and once you place them here, they will become available back in the editor. And so as you can see here, we have a bunch of new textures that we can choose from, and we just have to click on one of these and we can start assigning them to our array. And so as you can see, things are mapped to the wall and they're looking pretty good, and so this is the most basic way of setting up content in GeoPix. It's just a planar map, orthographic, nothing fancy going on. You just fit that to the bounds, and you could, at this point, just run a show switching between content like this. This could be your show. It's a very simple show. It would be the more straightforward approach. Maybe it's a good first or a couple second time setup if you haven't used GeoPix before, but you may want to eventually start digging into the more interesting things you can do with both macros and also with other things that we'll talk about later in this series. Since we're just talking about projectors now, let's see what we can do with this to make it more interesting. So one thing we can do is start rotating and skewing this projector. So I'm going to scale this out a little bit on Z so we can see where it's pointing. And yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and enable rotate mode with the E key. And if you want to do this through the menus, it's under Tools, Mode, Rotates right here. And so once you're in rotate mode, you'll see the message at the top, and you can just click anywhere to initiate rotation. And as you can see, we are rotating our texture and applying it to different areas with different kind of skewing. And right away you can see we've mapped this now to 3 clusters, and 2 of our clusters are dark. And so this is a very simple way, and there's better ways to do this, but this is a very straightforward way to simply mask stuff to a different portion of your LEDs. Because things fall outside of the projector bounds, they can be ignored. But that's also a setting you can tweak, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So anyways, a few of the things that we could do here is maybe rotate this, right? So to an extreme rotation, let's say we do -85, and then let's push this over on X, and now we've got some kind of skewed, interesting variation of this texture. It's pretty different, but it's using the same content, so that's cool. We could also scale this on Y, make this shorter, and we could boost this up, and we just want maybe have this texture go across the top portion of those panels. Maybe we want this to be an actual perfectly stretched texture, so we can do -90. So once we do that, if you zoom in, you can see that we're actually sampling a slice of this texture, and it's the slice that corresponds with where these LEDs are. And so we could move this on Z, and we could slice a different portion of that texture. We could take the middle if we wanted to. Lots of different ways to deal with that. But all in all, that's a different look as well. So maybe we want this stretched look. We actually want this stretched look to happen all the way up and down our panels. So one of the other features that projectors have that you will probably use a lot is the extend mode. So over here on the right, under projector, you can see that we're set on error color right now, and that's the default mode, which basically means anything that falls outside of the projector will be black. We have a few other options here. We have extend, cycle, and mirror. Extend extend is essentially going to take the edge pixel color and just stretch it all the way down to infinity. So there are situations you might be able to find creative ways to use this, but it's one of the less aesthetically pleasing ones generally. But again, this is the point of it's not to necessarily have one fixed way of doing it. It's coming up with creative ways to use things that maybe other people haven't thought of using that certain way before, which is what lends to a lot of the creativity and exploration kind of that projectors give you in GeoPix. Alright, so we've got extend here, but one of the more interesting looks you can use for this basic setup we have is probably cycle or mirror. So cycle is going to simply repeat the texture, and this is probably the one you'll use the most. If you want all of your LEDs to always be hit by something, cycle will definitely get you there. And depending on the texture, you might see that seam, that seam between repetitions more or less. So for example, this one at the angle we have it skewed at, you really can't tell, and it looks pretty clean. This looks like just a repeating generative pattern of some kind, but it's really just a texture, a video texture. And so let's plug a different texture in here, right? We could try something different without changing our projector at all. So we could try this one. This looks pretty cool. This could almost be like sped up. This could be like a strobe effect of some kind. Some of that yellowing you're seeing, I don't know if you're seeing that in the video, that's just voltage drop on some of my panels. Got to fix some of the wiring, so you need to ignore that. It's kind of interesting as well. And so maybe we want to like rotate things on Z, or maybe we want to rotate things on X. Lots of different ways we can rotate this. What else can we do with this? Well, let's actually scale this. Let's try a different texture first of all. Let's try this one, and let's scale Y back up. There's a certain technique I want to show you that will illustrate why mirror is nice, but finding the right pattern for that can be a little bit tricky. You know what, let's use the default ramp. I think that's actually going to be a pretty good test case. So if we just go ahead and fit back to scene, we hop back over here to our I/O tab. I'm going to select, let's see, let's try radial. Okay, this actually will illustrate things quite nicely. So you can, you might be able to see here that we have this texture, and we have kind of a hard edge cutting through the pattern here, right? This is because we're using cycle, and it's essentially repeating this texture edge to edge, but this is not a repeating texture by nature. If we're using something like a horizontal ramp, it does repeat, right? Because of the nature of ramps and the number of and the phase set that for this ramp, which we can't set for this ramp, but it's just built in. Things repeat nicely, right? But if you're using a radial, we have this seam, and so this is a good opportunity to use mirror. It actually kind of does what cycle does, but it flip-flops every other repetition of the texture. So let's go ahead and choose that. And I'm going to scoot this over just a little bit more. Alright. And so this is kind of a neat look, right? It gives you some symmetry, which is a nice look with textures, and you mirror symmetry either on Y or X. And this kind of inherently does that down the middle because we have the edge of the projector right here. Now we could put the projector over here. Whoops, we could put the edge of the projector. Let's just do this with the mouse. We could put it right here, and it would achieve the same thing because it's flipping it over this axis, and then it's putting it back to normal here, and then it's flipping it again here. And so this would be a good use case for why you might want mirror instead of repeat. But you know, maybe you want that hard edge. Maybe you're actually digging that look, and you may want that as well. So different ways to go about it. One other thing to mention, and this won't make as much difference to you until we get into other types of styles, right? We're using orthographic right now, but you have this parameter called scale here, which actually is a uniform scale for orthographic. It doesn't do anything too interesting. You could achieve that by scaling x and y just the same. However, this might be a good time to segue into projectors that are not orthographic. So let's go ahead and choose perspective from the menu here. And I'm going to scoot this back a little bit. I'm going to center this on X, Y, and Z, and then let's just kind of push this back to further away location. Okay, let's actually knock this down a bit. Right now we have a very distorted projection, perspective projection, and as you can see we have a little bit of a cone shape, but it's so wide that the shapes we're seeing on our panels are actually individual pixels of the texture. It's that scaled up. So what we actually want to do, these values need to be tweaked differently depending on what projector you're using. So for projectors like this, and maybe you actually like a pixelated look, right? This is kind of cool. I can see this being used actually, but I actually want a more refined look. So I'm going to go and dial this in to a more perspective-y scale. So now that we can see the cone here, it's going to become a little bit more clear what we're actually doing. And so I'll set this back to error color. And of course our projector is limited to just what it's hitting. Let me go ahead and increase the scale Z just a little bit more. That way it's kind of clear what we're doing. So, okay, we're projecting within the bounds of this projector, and you can see the texture hitting the LEDs, and it's doing its spiral thing, and that looks more or less the same. However, perspective gives us some interesting advantages when we're dealing with non-orthographic angles. So if we start to rotate this to a different angle, like maybe down here, for example, and let's change this default ramp into the circular one. Okay, cool. So all right, yeah, so we've got this down here. Let's rotate this up a bit, and let's actually change the extend mode to cycle, and let's actually scale this down a little bit. And so now we're getting a perspective texture, a perspective distortion here that's coming from like a bit of a horizon. There's like a horizon down there towards the bottom, and so this is kind of different, right? We now have a texture that's being highly repeated, and as it approaches the edges of the array, it's getting tighter and tighter, and almost too small for the LED's pitch, right? We're actually kind of getting down into the pixelation range of the geometry. So this is kind of a cool look, but you may want this to be a little bit wider. And you know, once you get this kind of interesting angle dialed in, you might want to try different textures. Like, what about this? This texture looks completely different when you apply it from this angle, and this one looks more or less the same, I guess. The spiral's probably a little too noisy. Different textures are gonna look different. This one's kind of interesting. Looks more or less the same, I guess. This is essentially gonna just give you a different look to the way your textures map. It's essentially just giving it more of a 3D look. So let's also try rotating on Y. Let's go this way. Let's go -45. Actually, let's go like, yeah, -75. I'm just going to translate this kind of into position here, and I'm actually going to increase the scale significantly. Scale down Y a little bit. And so what I'm trying to do here is find an interesting look on one side. Then I'm going to duplicate this projector and I'm going to mirror it to the other side, and you'll see what that does here in a moment. Okay, so I kind of like the way this looks on the left side. It's this gradient of like small to large. And so now that I've done that, I'm actually going to collapse this again. We actually don't need to see all this, but I want to show you what's going on here in the beginning. Now that we have this projector here, I'm going to duplicate it. And this projector is in the exact same place, so they're overlapping. And now I'm going to group this second projector. So I'm going to create a group. And as you can see, it's parented, and this group, though, by default, its origin is in the middle. And so what that means is I can actually scale this and flip this projector around to the other side. And of course, what this does for us is it gives us a mirrored look that uses the perspective to do the actual mirroring, and this is kind of a neat look, right? So now we can actually grab both of these projectors, and I'm actually going to unparent that projector from the group. We don't need to have it parented. And again, because we have all the way at the bottom, parent in place is on, these projectors will try to maintain their position when you unparent them. Sometimes that won't work out if you have skewing, which is a different transform attribute we're not dealing with in GeoPix, but for the 95% of your transforms, these will stay in the same place, and they'll try to do the best they can there. So we can now pick different textures for both of these at once, right? And we can start to pick some pretty neat looks that use this as like a mirrored look. This walking texture is actually not a great texture because we have kind of this resting color, which is just barely blue, so it's not a very good look. But some of the other ones look pretty nice. These two look pretty good. So, maybe I want to go ahead and get rid of some of the ones that haven't been really doing it for me. So these two can just go. Let's find one with like a very minimal brightness. Let's see how this one looks. Or this one. I think this will be a better option. Whoops, where'd you go? Okay, I like these black and white textures are doing it. I think these are good. So here's one of the new ones. It's actually quite bright. We can take this from cycle to error color, right? So we actually have a little bit less overlap. We can also try that one. I think that looks pretty sweet. I'm digging that look. And so you get the idea. You can basically start duplicating and flipping projectors to get kind of a mirrored image, even if you don't have a situation where you can mirror them with one projector. Something else to note, when you do this dual projector mirror system, you're actually compositing both of these projectors on top of each other. So what that means is what this projector contributes to the LEDs, it's getting added to what this projector contributes, and you have kind of an additive blend mode between those two. There's not a way to change that. That's pretty much just how they blend, but in the future there may be a way to tweak that. But if you need more precise control, we'll get into masking in the next tutorial, and that's going to be what you'd want to use to specify what LEDs get what, even in a bigger, broader projection like this. Cool, so this is pretty cool. I'm going to go and delete this projector that we made, and I'm going to talk about one other projector. Okay, so there's a third projector here, Chasers. We're going to talk about that at the very end. So the last thing I want to talk to you about is maybe a more granular approach to projectors, where you have a lot more projectors and you apply them maybe per fixture or per group. So I'm going to go ahead and reset this projector back to default and orthographic. And this is a good opportunity to kind of talk about fit selection. If we haven't already tried that, I will show you how that works. So if you expand your tree again and just select the fixtures of maybe, let's try the center cluster. That's an easy one to start with. So if I home in on that, you'll see that we have these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 projectors selected. So now I'm going to shift select the projector last, and once you've done that, you should have your projector attributes on the right, and then you can click fit selection. And what that does is it fits that projector to only the objects you had selected instead of all of them. And then, by the way, this does take into account the angle of your projector. So for example, if you have your projector rotated at a wonky angle like that, if you select all of these, and this works with fit scene as well as fit selection, by the way, you do fit selection, you're actually going to fit around that selection based on the angle you have. So this is a very useful tool to quickly encapsulate what you want without trying to fidget that, finesse that projector into place. So anyways, we're going to keep it orthographic for now, but just keep that in mind. That's a very useful way to get the top, front, sides, and also angles projected fully. So cool. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this projector a few more times. Let's go and duplicate all the ones we need. And once we've done that, I'm going to go ahead and name these projectors actually. P3, P2, P1, P4, and P5. Okay. So for P1, we'll just go through this process for each of these projectors, fit selection, and obviously this is super skewed, so the texture that we're using might not look correct, but we're going to leave that alone for now. We'll just focus on getting the things mapped very precisely. So G2, let's go and get these mapped out to projector 2 and fit selection. We'll do G3. G3's done. Let's go G4. Fit selection, and then G5 is up here for some reason, and then we will grab P5 and do a fit selection. And there we go. Now we have some interesting repetition that uses the size of every cluster as kind of a bounds. And this is pretty interesting, right? There's a lot we can do with this. I won't go too deep into some of those things. We'll just focus on the obvious. You can try some different textures. And go and make a new node. We'll talk about more of these nodes later, so don't worry too much if you're confused about this. But if you go to Effects and drop a ramp down, you can essentially create your own ramp that's kind of like this, but you can define your own keys. So you can edit the ramp. I'm going to delete all these keys, and we'll just make some new ones. So let's do a basic black to white black ramp, and we'll just go ahead and put that in the middle there, and cool. Alright, so for back over here we have our ramp, and we can just apply this, and that's kind of interesting. Let's go ahead and make it not pure white. It's gonna blow these LEDs out of proportion, so just make it red, and maybe we'll do like kind of a purple 0.8. Alright, let's just make a little ramp here. 0.2, 0.4, 0.6. go. All right. So that's fine. Well, let's just pick a different. Okay, cool. So ramps might be a more reasonable thing to use the projection layout like this, because you don't really want, or you don't care about the aspect ratio as much, because the texture's not, it's not a video that has obvious structure to it. It's just kind of more of an abstract pattern, right? So this could be kind of an interesting way to do content, right? You could make a macro or a set of macros that deals with localized projection, and maybe horizontal. Horizontal is a little bit different. It's just a different look, right? So also radial is kind of interesting. You could increase the repetitions here. That's kind of trippy, kind of prismatic, a little bit like shards of glass or something like that. Circular. Again, those edge ones really start to lose their fidelity because these are pretty low res panels, but there's, you could do a couple different things, a couple different ways with this layout. So yeah, you get the idea there. That is a localized kind of projection methodology, and so you could take that all the way down to the panel if you really wanted to. That would be a lot of projectors, so you would need to think about the number of panels you have in your scene. That may not be practical, and maybe you would want to bundle those projectors with your initial template when you build your layout. There's lots of different ways to do that. So anyways, that is about the end of the tutorial. There's one more thing I want to show you, and we only need one projector for that, and so I'll go ahead and delete these guys. Let's get one projector, and let's go ahead and fit this to the scene. And actually, you know what? Let's fit this all just to fixtures 1 through 4 over there on the left. Okay. So for this, I'm actually going to use the default ramp, but I'm going to change it to a horizontal. And you know what? Let's go ahead and stick with this ramp so we can control it a little bit more. We're going to do horizontal, and we're actually going to shrink this ramp way down. Let's make it small. Small bump of color, and then mostly dark. And then let's go ahead and reset the period. And so, all right, right now we have this animation that's going from left to right, and it's actually being mapped spatially across 2 dimensions here in the projector space, anyways. But that brings us to the third projector type that we have at this moment, which is called chasers. Chasers is a type of projector that actually doesn't care about the LED's position in 3D space. The only thing it cares about is its order. And so this essentially gives you the ability to create a chase that actually happens down the data line instead of across some dimensions spatially. And so I'm going to actually scale this up a little bit, and you'll notice that the texture's actually changing. This is a little bit of a weirder projector. It's a little bit more advanced in the sense that you don't have as clear of a sense of what it's doing, at least not at first. You'll notice that as I scoot this around, nothing's actually changing on the texture. Obviously, if I go too far up, we lose it because it's not within the bounds of the texture. But if it's in the bounds of the texture, it maps purely based on the order. And of course, the way to look at it essentially is if you take your LEDs and your panel and you map them across the top edge of your projector, that's how they're getting mapped. So you'll see that when the ramp color gets to the very end of the ramp here, at the very end, you'll see that the colors towards the end of the panel are lit up. Like this LED down here is the last LED in the chain, and this is the first. So you'll see that it's going from left to right, it's going from start to end. But it's doing that per fixture, right? So this is why you're getting this kind of repetition here, because our scale parameter over here, which is a very important parameter, now its purpose has changed dramatically. Its scale is set to 100, and because it's set to 100 and a panel is 100 pixels long, essentially, then we are looping perfectly between these fixtures. So if I were to adjust scale, you'll see that this kind of changes the way it works a little bit. It still happens per fixture, but actually you'll see the effect better if we go in the other direction. If we go down to say 50, we're actually going to chase all the way through the 50th pixel, and then it will simply cut the rest off. Now if we don't want it to cut the rest off, we can change the extend mode to something like cycle, or extend is going to do the flashing. Cycle will simply repeat it. So this is a good way to get a tighter chase, right? So if I do a scale of 25, we're getting a very tight chase, and that's kind of a cool look. If we do mirror, it's actually quite a lot more interesting. We could do 10, right? We get this kind of chase look. We could also go back to 50, and we kind of have this collision happening in the middle of the chain, right? We have the start and the end coming towards the middle. But what's really cool about this projector type is that you aren't just limited to basic ramps. You can put any texture in here that you want. Some are going to make more sense than others visually, but that's kind of half the fun of it, is you don't know what to expect, right? You're not sure what you're going to find, and just by experimenting you can find some really interesting looks. This is very fluid, and the texture itself is not in the least bit fluid, but the way it maps in this way is quite interesting. So anyways, that concludes this tutorial. I hope it was interesting. This was meant to be more of a kickback and just see what you can do with this kind of interesting device type, object type. And that's going to be it for this tutorial. In the next tutorial, we'll kind of dive back into the more concrete stuff, and we'll use a lot of the stuff that we talked about here as we build out our VJ system with the whole DMX plus LEDs. I will say that the next few tutorials will probably focus on some more kind of groundwork things like masking and other things like that. But then kind of halfway through another episode or two, we will switch to the DMX world, and then we'll tie it all together towards the end. So anyways, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next one. Bye.